Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I'm Jason Marzak. I am the director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council. Great to be having this lunchtime discussion among Good afternoon, everyone. Among a few of our friends. And thank you for joining us for this incredibly timely discussion on the USMCA. Now, just days before its signing in Argentina and Buenos Aires on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Today's event is being held in partnership with our Global Business and Economics program run by Bart Oosterveld in the front row, as well as in partnership with POLITICO. And Megan, it's a great collaboration to be doing this event with POLITICO, which is, I say, an invaluable resource. And I'm saying that not just because you're on the panel, but an invaluable resource for all things trade. I, like many others, am a dedicated reader of Morning Trade every day, or just about every day. We also like to be on the cutting edge, or at least close to it. So not only is this event being webcast, but we also encourage those who are here in person or who are watching via webcast to get out your phones and join the conversation on social media using the hashtag ACTrade. And for those of you who are watching online during the question and answer session, we will also be taking questions via Twitter. So please go ahead and submit your questions via Twitter. Now, before turning to the panel discussion, introducing our panelists, I'd like to put a few things into context. As many of you know, almost 25 years ago, 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement went into force. Much debate at that time arose around the benefits of the agreement to the U.S. economy. And since then, the agreement has become a fundamental part of the North American economy, significantly amplifying our competitiveness in the international market. It's also become critical to the U.S. economy itself. 33 U.S. states count Mexico as one of their top 3 export markets. 35 claim Canada as their most important foreign market. The agreement has also had real tangible effects on local communities. More than 14 million jobs depend on trade with Mexico and Canada. And today, just 3 days before its signing in Buenos Aires, questions over the implications for U.S. consumers, competitiveness, and the effects on the business environment at large deserve continued attention. Trade can be one of the most important motors of growth and development, with positive effects on wages, employment, and the quality of jobs. The question is, how do we actually implement these agreements to make that happen, to make sure that the fruits of free trade are realized by workers and consumers across countries? Since talks wrapped up with Canada just hours before the midnight deadline on September 30th, I was probably one of many people, including some of you in the room, who was on Twitter following what was happening at 10 o'clock at night, at 10:15 at night on that September 30th. A lot has been said about what this new agreement means. We're going to dig deeper into that today with an eye toward the implications for consumers, but also a look at what its future is now in a soon-to-be divided Congress. It's very important to be having this discussion today as we prepare for continued debate as the U.S. International Trade Commission report will soon get underway, as well as implementing legislation is eventually submitted after signature of the agreement. With that, I'm delighted to welcome our 4 expert speakers for a timely discussion, and then we'll follow that up by question and answer. Let me introduce each of them briefly. I'll start with you, Undersecretary McKinney. Great to have you. In the middle, there's Undersecretary Ted McKinney, who is the Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Undersecretary McKinney is a Hoosier currently living in Washington and previously served as the Director of the Indiana State Department of Agriculture. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Next to him is Maria Zieba. Maria is the Director of International Affairs for the National Pork Producers Council. Maria also has significant experience with the National Milk Producers Federation, the U.S. Dairy Export Council, and the USDA's Foreign Agriculture Service. Maria, great to have you as well. Next to Undersecretary McKinney, to his left, to your right, is Stephanie Holland. Stephanie is the current Director of International Government and Regulatory Affairs at the Computing Technology Industry Association, CompTIA. Having great knowledge in trade and the technology sectors, not only for the North American market, but more broadly globally. And sitting next to Stephanie is Megan Casella. Megan is somebody who I'm sure you frequently read her reporting. We are going to switch roles today, and I am going to be asking the reporter questions. Megan is a trade reporter for Politico Pro and also co-author of the Morning Trade newsletter. So with that, thank you all for being here today, and let's jump into the discussion. Undersecretary McKinney, I'm going to start with you. The trade deal comes after the bilateral announcement in August of the U.S.-Mexico trade deal, and then, as I mentioned, the trilateral deal announced just moments before midnight at the end of September. From your vantage point at USDA, what do you see as the biggest wins in the agreement, and also what would you potentially like to see included that is not in the deal?
Sure. Well, let me just first say thanks to the Atlantic Council and to Politico for your partnership. These are great opportunities, and count me a fan. So let me just make sure I say that because it's very important. Oh, I think if you had to summarize USMCA or NAFTA 2.0, if you can't roll a USMCA off the tongue, it's excitement. I know that many people were skeptical of whether it was the right thing to do. I am an unabashed fan of what's taken place, and let me cite 2 or 3 reasons. If I looked selfishly, and I think that's your question.
That's my question.
Our dairy farmers were getting hammered by some of the activities that were taking place in Canada, notably the addition of Class 7 milk. Class 7 milk wasn't so bad. It's just the net effect was to then dump milk powder, dry milk powder and butter on the world market, and it was harming our dairy farmers significantly, but I would also say Europe and New Zealand. And so it was running contrary to the whole spirit of free, fair, and reciprocal trade. So I think that got fixed, and that gives modest additional access by our dairy markets to Canada. But more importantly, it set the rules, I think, for the future so that those kinds of things are kept in check. So it's, I think, the forward-looking as much as the current access that'll be important. 2 little-known or lesser-known pieces that I think are enormous is that there's a brand new chapter on the biosciences. Biotechnologies, I think, offer enormous potential for not just food and ag, so crops and livestock and poultry, but even human health. And so for the first time, that's captured in language in a brand new chapter of USMCA. Oftentimes that is forgotten. And I include in that the very, very powerful and opportunistic gene editing that I think brings great promise for disease management in crops, disease or other problems in livestock, poultry. Another one is a rewrite of the phytosanitary chapter. Now, many people don't know what SPS is, but I've seen globally. I've traveled to 21 countries now in a little over a year, and SPS chapters are those that are oftentimes used and abused. Oftentimes they're an excuse on why a country says no to some other country's products. And to clarify the kind of rigor that science requires to make sure that someone is truthful and not just putting up a trade barrier. That's very, very important. If you want me to go further, I think our wheat farmers now have greater access. For those that don't know, wheat on one side of the border in North Dakota was considered feed grade, and the same wheat on 1 mile into Canada was food grade. And let me tell you, there is a difference in price. That's not very fair. I won't put at the feet of the Canadian government, at the federal government, but provinces have some flexibility too. And we saw in the case of one province a gross inequity and fairness in importation of wines and distilled spirits and where those could be featured. So I would say there's some modest additional access in dairy, places like wheat, but I think the real bonus is the long term on the biosciences and the phytosanitary chapters.
Very interesting. And as you mentioned, that has gotten much less attention in the discussions around USMCA, bioscience, sanitary, phytosanitary. I want to get more into Class 7 later on in the discussion, so we'll pick that up further. Megan, let me turn to you. There's a number of, the USMCA keeps a number of provisions of its predecessor. There has also been significant changes to a number of sectors. And outside of agriculture, Stephanie will talk about technology. Talk us through what you see as some of the other major changes to the agreement, perhaps There's been a lot of discussion on the auto industry, but also dispute settlement mechanisms.
Absolutely. So thanks again for having us. And you're right that the auto industry has gotten a lot of the conversation surrounding the biggest changes in USMCA, and I think it's fair. They did see some of the biggest policy changes in USMCA, and so that's the tightened rule of origin from 62.5% to 75%. That's a new wage provision that dictates how much of a car must be produced by workers earning at least $16 an hour. There are other provisions mandating sourcing and where auto companies must get some of their steel and aluminum and other materials, and how much of that must come from within North America. And so those are major changes for the auto industry with major implications. And I think we're going to get a little bit into that later in terms of what some of the concerns are surrounding that. But in Canada and Mexico, they are at least pleased with one aspect of autos, which is sort of a side deal to the USMCA, which is that because they've agreed to quotas, they've gotten sort of immunity to any future automotive 232 tariffs, which is at least, they see that as a good thing. But there's also concerns that it makes North America as an industry less competitive, and we'll get a little bit more into that. On dispute settlement, there is a lot of talk surrounding what used to be known as Chapter 19, which is a dispute settlement mechanism focused on trade remedies, so anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And that is left untouched, and that's seen as a huge win for Justin Trudeau. We understand that that was a last-minute compromise that Canada agreed to open its dairy industry a little bit further in exchange for preserving Chapter 19, and that's a mechanism that they've used in the ongoing softwood lumber dispute with the United States. So that's somewhere where they really won. The other investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which was known as Chapter 11, is pared down a lot. It's going to be phased out with Canada and is cut down severely with Mexico. You know, it could be seen as a win for Canada as well, given that there were more cases against Canada under that. But it's also something that USTR Lighthizer also really wanted. He had seen investor-state dispute settlement as a way for corporations to sort of undercut a nation's sovereignty. So that there as well. There's other smaller things. There's a currency, anti-currency manipulation provision that
we'll get into that later.
We'll get into that too. Yes. There's some, we'll get into these I think as well, but some gender discrimination, anti-gender discrimination, and LGBT protections that are seen as a big win for Canada too. They really wanted some of those progressive elements in the deal. So overall, you know, the Trump administration got a lot of the things that it pushed for. Mexico made some concessions, Canada got some wins, and they're all touting it as a win for them.
And on Chapter 19, there was a lot of question after Mexico signed its, or agreed to its, not signed, but agreed to its bilateral deal with the United States. Chapter 19 had dropped off at that point, and then they basically left it to the Canadians who were so adamant about moving that forward to then ensure that Chapter 19 came back into the accord when it was actually announced with Canada. Yeah,
huge priority for Canada, and we saw that they weren't as willing to sign the deal without that in it, and they, you know, through the dairy trade-off, they got that win.
Maria, let me turn to the pork industry. Probably, similar to the Undersecretary's comments, probably a little less talk on how USMCA affects your industry. Walk us through a little bit how this agreement affects, especially the export of U.S. pork to our neighbors, Mexico. We were talking before about Mexico, Canada as well, and how also this agreement would potentially affect the supply chain for the pork industry overall.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today and to be with this distinguished panel. For our producers, we're really happy with the agreement. As is, I think the Trump administration really delivered on its promise to do no harm. We've maintained the zero duty market access that we've enjoyed into both Canada and Mexico. And to put things into some perspective, last year we exported over $6 billion in pork and pork products, of which to Mexico we exported $1.5 billion, and to Canada about $800 million. So it's significant to have that market access and to continue to have that market access, especially at a zero duty, when our biggest competitors are negotiating with Canada and Mexico, and the industries domestically are also expanding. So for us, it's a big win that we've maintained that stability, and we've been able to say, okay, we're done with the negotiations. We're going to continue to be able to export to Canada and Mexico and to grow those markets. for us as a supply chain, we're really integrated. We're integrated with Canadian prices, with US prices. Mexico is growing as an industry. And so I think this is beneficial for all three of us. We've seen that as we prosper in our exports, so does Mexico and so does Canada. And some of that is through their initiation of initiating free trade agreements with the rest of the world. So I think it's a win for all three countries and all three producers. So
it maintains stability. Does it take you to the next level? Does it give additional benefits for the pork industry, or it maintains that status quo?
It maintains a bit of that status quo. I think where we're going to see a lot of the gains, as Ted pointed out, was on the SPS chapter, sanitary and phytosanitary, throughout the years where we have seen a lot of the pushback and a lot of where we've really had to fight is where we have an unlevel playing field. And that's usually through non-tariff barriers to trade, and not necessarily on tariffs. It's mostly, a country basing their decision to not accept U.S. products, or U.S. pork specifically, because of how we raise our pigs, which isn't based on any science. Mm-hmm. It's just based on a gut feeling that they don't like it. And that's something that we try to avoid, because we need to have rules and standards that way that everybody can play on a level playing field.
Stephanie, let me bring you into the discussion. USMCA also includes new chapters on digital trade, e-commerce, finance, that will have significant implications for emerging technology. Many of us in this room are tech savvy. Probably some of us are not as tech savvy. If you could you walk us through a little bit on what these provisions, what the real impact is of some of these key provisions in the technology sector, both insofar as how business is conducted, but also going to the theme of this discussion, what are also the consumer implications of these new provisions?
Sure, well, thank you. CompTIA represents about 120 major technology companies spanning from hardware to software to internet. And Mexico and Canada, respectively, are the #1 and 2 export destinations for U.S. tech products. We also are seeing a 14% year-over-year increase in tech service exports to Mexico and Canada. And based on new CompTIA research this year, exports to Canada and Mexico directly support 250,000 U.S. American jobs. So these are important markets for our industry, and NAFTA has been beneficial. What we're seeing in USMCA is really this modernization, taking digital trade to the next level, and really capturing all the changes that have occurred in the technology landscape since NAFTA was negotiated. There are very strong provisions around digital trade in the new Chapter 19, and these go further than the U.S. has negotiated in the past, in fact. And so we recognize and support those because they're important not just to the technology industry, but these digital provisions are important to all industries of all sizes that use the internet and work from the internet. So I want to highlight some key provisions in the digital trade chapter that are essential, and that is, first and foremost, it ensures the cross-border transfer of data, including that of personal information. And it also prevents forced localization or the localization of data storage in country. Now, essential to that underpinning of data transfer.
What does that, for people who might not know, what does that mean? What are the implications of that?
Yeah, so that's a requirement that we're seeing from countries around the world to require data storage, servers, computing facilities in country where technology, where data is being transferred, and often that of personal information. So this really is protecting that personal information, in that there's also a privacy regulation prescription in here, I should say. And that's new to a trade agreement as well. There's a specific recognition for the APEC cross-border privacy rules, which the U.S. has been very supportive of, and this privacy provision that supports the development of compatible data privacy regimes around the world and in different countries. There are also provisions to protect source code, algorithms, which you have on your phone you use every day, but also encrypted key, which are important to commercial use. And there are also important provisions around the use of banning customs duties for electronically transmitted goods. And this is important because we're seeing these barriers crop up in countries around the world. I want to highlight two new provisions that the negotiators included here that we hadn't seen them negotiate before. And one is in regard to cyber provisions, which our members are keenly excited about and interested. The USMCA calls for risk-based cyber mechanisms over regulation. So this shows a coordinated approach and that the three countries are committed to this common approach to using tools that are risk-based when identifying cyber threats. So that's important, and we were pleased to see that. And another was in the IP chapter, not the digital trade chapter, but it's called intermediary liability protections. And this is actually consistent with US law in that platforms are not responsible and not liable for the content that users post on their platform. So that was another big achievement.
So what are the implications of all these new provisions for US consumers?
Sure, U.S. consumers and small businesses alike that are using the internet, they are used to having the ability for their internet use to not be restricted. Small businesses are thriving on the ability to reach consumers all around the world and sell their products to the 95% of consumers that live around the world, and to have provisions that do not restrict market access and allow them to create more exports and in turn create more jobs. That's important for Americans.
Great. Another round of questions here before we go to the road ahead for Congress. But Arst and McKinney, I promised we would go back to Class 7.
Sure.
Canada's low-price milk proteins policy. It's been eliminated from USMCA, as you mentioned. Right. Explain a little first what this means for U.S. Dairy producers and first, I guess, maybe the origins of Class 7,
sure.
and then from there, what this means for U.S. producers and consumers with its elimination.
Sure. Well, you can't talk about dairy policy in Canada without recognizing that they have what they call a managed supply system. Nothing wrong with that. I think Secretary Perdue said many times, if you've got a managed supply system, please manage it. The catch was that they were improving or increasing productivity, increasing production, which gives you a lot of products that you can use internally, but the result was it caused for a great excess, in this case, of dry milk powder. For those that don't know, if you're going to ship dairy products, you don't want to ship the milk with all the liquid. You dry it, ship the powder. So they were dumping dry milk powder and butter on the world market and depressing prices. And that in itself was troublesome enough, but it's a time when our dairy farmers were in year 5, we're now entering year 6 of a very depressed farm and ranch economy, almost all commodities. So our dairy farmers were hemorrhaging. There were reports out of Wisconsin of losing a dozen farms a week. It was that kind of pace. Not because of the supply management system abuse, but because it was that on top of 5 years of a depressed economy. I want to be very fair. So the fact that this got right-sized is very significant. If you've got a managed milk supply system, please manage it. Don't dump your excess on the rest of the world. And so I think that by and large is, or supposed to be, fixed. And that is significant. I think out of that also comes some modest additional access to the Canadian market for our dairy, but also some very modest access to our market. I mean, I have always said, and I say this on every single trip I take, trade is a two-way street. Of course we want to export more. We're very productive U.S. in terms of food and agriculture. Of course we do. But if I win and someone else loses, that's a pretty short relationship. So we do seek win-win, and that's something that we seek, and we saw it in this case. The problem was it was skewed very heavily toward Canada, and so if there was a lot of discussion about them giving a lot, well, yeah, it had to. That's the way it all had come out. Now, we get some, I think there's some additional things. There's this problem called geographic indicators where parts of the world, largely Europe, are trying to claw back some cheese names or dairy names, in some cases some wines and spirits that frankly we brought here decades, if not centuries ago. So there was agreement that some of the more common names that have been in this North America continent, including Mexico, for decades, if not more, are now protected. We're not going to have to give those back unfairly. Others, Europe or other countries, did get protections on. And so I think the negotiations worked that out very, very well.
And so, Secretary, what does this, again, similar question to Stephanie, what does this mean for U.S. consumers?
Well, for U.S. consumers, I'll start with our farmers. I think some of the hemorrhaging will stop. Yeah. That's one. I think we're going to continue to have dairy products at very reasonable prices because of our own productivity, but because they are no longer going to be doing what they've been doing. And I think choice is very important. There's innovation going on all parts of the world, including Canada, including Mexico, and so we're going to enjoy choice, as will our friends north, as will our friends to the south.
Now, Megan, let me turn back to you. Thank you very much. Let me turn back to you. And I think as we've been talking, I mentioned at the outset that the agreement will be signed. And when I was on, I think Larry Kudlow just confirmed that it will be signed at the G20 again just now. Megan, the provisions on the auto industry, let's go back there. What will be the impact, again, for consumers of North American automobiles with these changes to the auto sector? And then also, what does this mean for things like Chinese cars in the North American market and other foreign-produced, foreign autos sold here in the United States?
The major concern is that it could raise costs for U.S. consumers who are purchasing cars here. And that's, you're looking at an industry that is already experiencing a slowdown in new car sales. And it's going to cost money for them to re-examine their supply chains, to move some of their production, to start paying workers more. Probably less by paying workers more in Mexico and more by shifting more jobs to the U.S. and Canada. They're going to be paying to invest capital in new plants if they do have to shift that production. And they're doing all of this also with steel and aluminum tariffs in place and under the threat of future automotive tariffs. And so what progress there might be, or what the help that this might bring to U.S. auto companies is sort of offset by these major concerns that it's going to raise prices on cars. And so what that means for Chinese cars, for foreign companies, is that if you're not operating in the North American market, you don't have to meet these standards. And so the concern is that then it makes North American auto companies less competitive globally, because they're putting so much capital and so much focus and time and money into meeting these new standards that then they're not able to compete as well as they could on the global stage.
And there's also the provisions on higher wages in the auto sector, and whether companies in the end will decide to pay those higher wages or forego the benefits of USMCA and keep the wages lower. Exactly.
Yeah, they could try to work around the deal, and the alternative currently is just to pay the 2.5% tariff. There's some concerns in the industry, though, that if they rely on that, the Trump administration might try to do something to hike that tariff. So that's sort of left unclear in the agreement, and so there's still some uncertainty as to whether they could do that. But folks are concerned that it could incentivize offshoring rather than the opposite.
Now Maria, Megan brought up tariffs. Of course, tariffs are not part of the deal, and that's probably part of the reason we're having this discussion. There was some thought that the steel and aluminum tariff, a deal could be made prior to the signing of the agreement on Friday. We are now just 3 days away from Friday. We don't have a resolution on steel and aluminum tariffs. What are the implications if those tariffs are not lifted, specifically for your industry?
Thanks for that question. For our producers, we've been facing a 20% duty of our exports, pork and pork products, to Mexico since July. If that continues on and for a while, then we won't be able to really see the benefits of the USMCA. It's going to negate those gains. We really cannot compete when we have to pay a 20% tax on our exports, especially, as I mentioned, Mexican producers are increasing their production of pork. Mexico is importing a lot of pork from Canada, Chile. Now they have a new FTA with the EU. I mean, it makes it so that we aren't as competitive as we would like to be. And so that's what we're very concerned about that, and we're working with the administration to make sure that those tariffs are removed as soon as possible, because we can withstand the pressure, but only for so long.
And for your industry, I mean, that it's also, I mean, it's all the inputs that go into the industry are affected by those tariffs.
That's correct. We were in the middle of an expansion a few years ago because we thought we were going to see increased market access into the Trans-Pacific region. That meant that in rural communities all over the United States, our producers were building new barns, which use steel and aluminum. There were new housing. Buying tractors, buying combines, that all fuels the U.S. economy in a lot of sectors that we really don't have, a lot of sectors of the U.S. that really, there's not that much going on. And the fact that we have such an impact on the rural community, that's what we're also concerned about. Mexican consumers at this point have to pay 20% more for U.S. pork, and that's not fair for them either.
Mm-hmm. I see some heads nodding on the panel as Maria's talking. Stephanie, let me turn back to you on IT. I think it would be remiss if we were talking about USMCA and we didn't talk about the U.S.-China trade dispute and its implications on U.S. trade. And specifically, part of the origin of this is around intellectual property theft. Talk us through a little bit on what you see as from the industry on the potential end game to protect the IT sector, and how do the new provisions in the USMCA play or potentially not play a role in that?
Right. Well, the USMCA digital trade provisions directly counter what we're seeing around the world with regard to these restrictive trade barriers in the digital space. In China, of course, there's a Section 301 investigation and such that is looking into and has produced reports now regarding the joint venture requirements and partnerships and the security requirements in China that compel and require U.S. companies to disclose source code and intellectual property as a means of doing business in China. We're also seeing with their cybersecurity law and other related measures an effort to localize data or otherwise have overly restrictive practices with regard to data transfer. And this is exactly what we're talking about here in the United States with the Section 301 investigation. So as the United States considers new trade agreements with partners such as Japan, the EU, the UK, this is where we should start. We should use these provisions in the USMCA, the digital provisions, and draw from them as we negotiate with these new trading partners. And in fact, we encourage the United States to include these negotiations in the fore of their talks with these important trading partners. So there's an opportunity here where we could perhaps build a coalition of like-minded countries with regard to our beliefs and our practices on digital trade with these important markets. Japan in particular, they're a country with which we have a trilateral dialogue underway right now. We've had an internet economy dialogue with Japan for the last 10 years. So we have a real foundation for which to base upon digital trade principles. So we have an opportunity with a key market in a key region of the world where we're seeing barriers to write rules for digital trade and set new norms, new rules in digital trade.
Now I want to turn to thank you very much. If you want to turn to the road ahead in Congress. And don't worry, this first question is not for the industry representatives or for the undersecretary. It's going to go to our Politico reporter. Megan, this year's, of course, midterm elections, as everybody in this room and watching knows very well, resulted in a divided Congress, majority Republican Senate, majority Democrat House. How might this affect ratification, or the process of ratification? What are you seeing both on the next steps, the likely timeline, and how these political changes in Washington might affect that?
Sure. So I think, as most people here probably know, we still have a really long road ahead for ratification of the deal, and it might just have gotten longer with the divided Congress. It's not to say that the deal won't pass. It's not to say that it will. It just means that there's going to be a lot of debate. There's likely to be a lot of back and forth between Congress and the administration. As changes that House Democrats might want to see, tweaks that they might want made, and House Republicans as well. I think we'll get into a little bit of that. The next steps, once they sign on Friday, that starts the clock for the International Trade Commission to finish its report on the economic impact of the agreement. So they've started that. They've held hearings, several days worth of hearings a couple weeks ago, where industries could testify as to what they felt would be the impacts on their industry. And they have up to 105 days to complete that. So that puts us in the middle of March. They don't have to take that much time, but it's likely that they will. They don't tend to be easily convinced to rush their work. And so that, if that puts us in the middle of March, Congress is not legally required under Trade Promotion Authority to wait for that report, but it's expected that they will. And then there's going to be a number of first documents that the administration has to send to Congress. So they send the final text after they sign it. It's possible there could be some tweaks from the draft text that we saw last month. There's the Statement of Administrative Action detailing what's going to change in U.S. law, what those tweaks will look like or changes will look like. There's the draft implementing bill, which is the actual legislation that Congress will pass. And under Trade Promotion Authority, they're not allowed to make any amendments, but they'll hold a mock markup in both chambers. They likely will, they're not required to. But that just means that's an opportunity for them to say to the administration, you might want to look at the labor chapter or the environmental chapter and make this tweak or that one if you want to guarantee our support. So it's the opportunity to do that. And then the House will go first because it is a revenue bill, and then the Senate if they have to report out the bill and consider it and bring it to the floor for a vote. And that's if it stays on TPA. And it's not guaranteed that it will. It wouldn't be unprecedented for House Democrats if they do have big issues with the bill to take it off of fast track. Nancy Pelosi, the likely next Speaker of the House, in a former stint in that role in 2008, she had some lingering concerns over the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement and voted to pull that off fast track, and that deal then passed in 2011, 3 years later, and took effect in 2012. So we have a ways to go with this one.
How likely do you see that?
It's not really for me to say. I mean, I think that's more of an extreme move, but I do think that we're going to see significant debate over the next several months about this deal.
Undersecretary McKinney, as Megan's mentioning, there will be the potential for a number of different tweaks to the agreement. I think that's not necessarily always understood, that once an agreement is signed, that there are tweaks that are made, especially before it gets to a potential final vote. What tweaks do you see as possible for the agriculture sector?
Sure. Well, I don't know. I've read in the media that labor and environment are always some that come up in these kinds of things. My hope, though, and I'm not in USTR, who had the lead on the negotiations. Now, at any given time, I had 2 to 20 of my team working in support to add bandwidth. My sense is there's the hope that they had reached out enough to Congress, and that's for each member to determine. I know that some of that did occur, and I think the hope is that the Congress will find this as an acceptable package, because we all know that one tweak may be one other country's heartburn. And so the hope is that the negotiations with the consultation that has taken place will suffice. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. All I know is this is a big damn deal, and we hope it does move through.
Maria, similar to you, from your constituents, what are you hearing? Are there certain changes that you're speaking very positively about the agreement in your assessment of it? Do your constituents want to see certain changes as it goes to the ratification process, or are they pretty content with it?
I think the number one priority for them is to get this passed as soon as possible, at least on the trade front. It's for them, we still have that uncertainty that this is lingering, and as long as that's there, it's really going to hamper any future investments. Why would you invest in your farm or increase production if you don't know if you're going to have access to the Mexican and Canadian markets at zero duty? Yep. So I think for them, they need this deal passed as soon as possible. And for most of agriculture, I think we're pretty happy with what we got. So we need this through.
Stephanie, what are you hearing from your association members?
Yeah, well, our members I'll mention one concern of theirs, and that's regarding government procurement. The United States started those negotiations with a dollar for dollar approach. That's not where they landed, and business was quite frustrated with that approach. But this agreement does not give us any new market access opportunities in government procurement. In fact, it eliminates government procurement for Canada. And with regard to Mexico, it maintains the same levels in NAFTA. So this is not something we want to see replicated in future trade agreements. And you may wonder why the tech industry cares so much about government procurement. And that's because in some countries around the world, the governments themselves are the largest buyer of tech products and services. And so it's so important that this is done right, that we get these commitments that are non-discriminatory towards U.S. technologies, and there's transparency around the purchasing of those products. So this is an opportunity where we can now educate. We know we have a challenge ahead of us, and I think we should take it upon us to educate the stakeholders about the importance of government procurement.
Megan, one of the issues that can potentially prevent an expedited process in the Congress are issues around labor. And after the labor standards were not part of the formal agreement, and they were instead included in a side deal. For the USMCA, one side you have House Democrats that have indicated they want stronger, more enforceable labor standards. At the same time, there are some Republican lawmakers who have spoken out against certain aspects of USMCA, specifically Article 23 that gives provisions to protect labor rights and discrimination on the basis of sex, including with regard to pregnancy, sexual harassment, sexual orientation, gender identity. Do you see those divisions, and there are probably some others out there as well on the labor front, as really potentially preventing this agreement from moving forward as quickly in Congress, especially now with the divided Congress?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's going to be the biggest two issues right there. We focused a lot on Democrats when they did take over the House and looking at whether that would stop the administration from getting enough support in the House. The Trump administration needs 218 votes in the House to pass this deal. Republicans have about 198 seats next year. I believe that there might still be some races outstanding, and so the question is, could they pick up 20 Democrats who might want to see stronger labor provisions, who might want a side deal negotiated to make them even more enforceable, that sort of thing. That seems like that could have been possible. I mean, Nancy Pelosi has always been one who has let her caucus vote with their district on trade rather than along party lines, which means that a Democrat took over Dave Reichert's seat, for example, the former trade subcommittee's chairman. So someone like that in a very free trade oriented district, you would think they would vote in favor.
Mm-hmm.
But if on top,
that's Washington State.
Yeah, Washington State. But then if on top of that you also have House Republicans threatening not to vote in lockstep with their party because of these gender provisions, gender non-discrimination provisions that Canada really pushed for. I don't see Canada being flexible and withdrawing those. And so, it was about 40 House Republicans that I believe sent a letter saying they were concerned about these, and at least a couple of them were threatening not to vote for the agreement because of it. So if neither of those issues is resolved, and you have both progressive Democrats threatening not to vote for it because of labor and conservative Republicans not voting for it because of those provisions, then I think it might be harder to get to that 218.
Great, thanks, Megan. I want to turn to Undersecretary McKinney for my last question for the panel. I promise I actually probably have 15 or 20 more questions, but I want to make sure that we turn it over to everybody in the audience and watching via webcast for your questions. So let me think of your questions to your hand, sir, in the third row, but let me ask my last question to Undersecretary McKinney, which is the fact that there's been, in some regards, the signing on Friday of USMCA is seen as a potential pivot point, right? That there's been so much attention on getting this deal done in North America, and once this deal is done, this could open the door for not only using some of the different aspects of the deal as blueprints for other trade accords, but also negotiating other trade accords. You've spoken about this. Please share your perspective on how you see this, the signing of USMCA, and then it's moving forward in Congress as being a pivot point from a broader agenda.
Sure. Well, USMCA on its own has been a beacon and example of how great trade can occur and should occur for many years. And I think this version to be signed this week, I think improves on that. 25 years later, it's probably needed a modernization. So let's start there. But to your point, it provides new language, updated language that reflects the more modern society, whether it's technology or biosciences or pork or whatever it might be, that can be that great template or pieces of templates for future trade deals. And we're already seeing that at play. I'm convinced that the reason we could announce the intent to negotiate with Japan came because this is getting settled. I said I've been in 21 countries. I know that there's been discussions from those other countries about one piece or another, if not the totality of USMCA. So the opportunity that this presents cannot be under or overstated. It is that significant in terms of a template that others might look to. Don't have to take it lock, stock, and barrel, but can look to as examples for the future. And I think that's what's so exciting. The list is very long of countries we want to do bilaterals or free trade agreements or whatever one might call them. And we can't get there fast enough as far as I'm concerned.
Fantastic. First question in the third row. If you could, sir, please just state your name and affiliation. A microphone will come is next to you. So to your left is a microphone.
Thank you, Guy Erb, former trade official. Given what Megan Casella said about the obstacles to quick passage, what concerns do you have or threats would you define to the existing NAFTA?
Threats to the existing NAFTA. Great. If there's, is there another question to take in this first round? No. Okay. Megan, since he referenced you in the question, I'll turn it over to you for the answer.
Well, I guess I would say, I mean, there's an ongoing concern that the administration would withdraw from NAFTA 1.0 in order to force a vote on 2.0. I think, as far as I know, that's still there. I mean, it can always remain a scenario, but it's not something that we have seen evoked very recently. It's not something that currently hangs over anyone's head too closely. But it is still there, and I've talked with industry folks who say that they are not, or analysts who have spoken with Democrats and say that they are not so willing to vote against the deal because they don't want then the alternative to be nothing and no trilateral trade agreement in North America. So it's very risky to vote against the deal in the hopes that NAFTA 1.0 remains because there's no certainty that it would. I hope that helps.
Anybody else want to jump in there? If not, a question from Twitter from at Art Keller, which is ratification of the USMCA deal something lawmakers can hold hostage to fend off President Trump's threats about shutting down government without a border wall deal? And maybe I'll even broaden that question since that question pertains to the next week or so. And as you were outlining, Megan, the process is much longer than that. But are there other things that, looking into 2019, the Congress might hold ratification of the deal, hold it up for other provisions that it seeks?
I think they could, certainly. There's a lot of give and take, of course, with this. But I also think that in regards to my last answer, I think it's another area where it would be risky for lawmakers who particularly really want this. And they want, after so many threats to withdraw from NAFTA, they want to make sure that USMCA, that a trilateral trade agreement in some form takes place. I think they're also concerned about the risks of, I guess, taking it too far and then leading to new threats to withdraw again.
Okay. Other questions from the audience? I promise I have more questions, but I want to make sure that everybody in the room has an opportunity. Yes, toward the back. The microphone's coming over to you.
Sam Maldev, Wilson Center. We mentioned some of the potential roadblocks to passage in the United States. Are there other potential ones from Canada and Mexico, considering there's a new administration about to start in Mexico and a government in Canada that has faced some opposition to some of the concessions made in the deal? What potential roadblocks might we see there?
Megan, I'll let you start off, and then I might jump in as well. I'll let you start off, too.
You actually might be more familiar here, because I've been focused more on U.S. Congress and its passage, so you might know better.
So I'll start off on the Mexican front. This is a deal where the incoming president, who takes office on on Saturday, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, he actually had members of his incoming administration sitting alongside the Mexican trade negotiators once he was elected on July 1st. So this is an agreement in which the incoming Mexican administration has been very much a part of, even given the long transition period in Mexico. And so important for the incoming administration that President Peña Nieto, the current president, signs it, but there is support in the Mexican Congress for the deal, and there are a number of provisions that him and his party have been able to get into the accord, even though they were not part of the official negotiating process. And you know, on the Canadian side as well, I mean, there are some concerns that of course linger, but the main concerns when we look at whether how the potential of this agreement to be ratified come back to the U.S. Congress, and this is why we're having a discussion today on the U.S. Congress and the road ahead in the U.S. Congress, because the Mexican and the Canadian sides, not that there couldn't be roadblocks along the way, but it's much more likely an easy ratification or easier ratification in both those countries. Other questions? Yes, Diana.
Diana Negroponte, also from the Wilson Council. Does passage of the USMCA encourage the President to move forward on accession to CPTPP? Have we made a step forward?
Thanks, Diana. I'll open up to anyone on the younger side. Do you want to jump in?
I'll try. In short, I don't think it does. There might have been that possibility, that hope, that thought by many, were it not already announced that there would be bilateral negotiations. So I think not. And I think, let's not forget, there are parts of the TPP, or the new TPP 11. There are parts of that that are good. There are other parts the President and the team did not like. So I think we'll see a look at some parts of that as we go forward with Japan, or for that many others. And likewise, there'll be parts of that that are just off limits, and it'll be a new pathway. So I don't see a pathway there, particularly since the announcement's already been made we're going a different direction.
And
yeah, I would agree with that.
And Stephanie, I mean, a number of the technology provisions in the USMCA even exceed what had been part of the original TPP discussions.
That's right. So doing our own bilateral with Japan might be an opportunity for us to get some of those cyber provisions or others with Japan.
Yes. Eighth row back. It's a quick count.
Hi, Marilee, International Trade Today. This is a question for Maria. You mentioned how you would like the tariffs lifted as soon as possible, so the retaliatory tariffs on pork would be lifted. Do you have any insight from USTR whether that is going to happen this week? And if not, what the timeline is? And also, if a quota system is the replacement, do you know if that will be enough to get Mexico to lift its retaliatory tariff?
Great question.
The timing is unclear. I know that there's discussions, and I know that this is something that the administration has really put a lot of time and effort to resolving. They've heard plenty from our producers, but the timing is unclear. I'm not sure, and it's the sooner. It could not come off fast enough for our producers. We've been facing these tariffs since July, and you know, the Mexican government would probably be the best people to answer whether a quota system would work for them. I'm really not sure.
We've seen a quota as a replacement with regard to other countries. Megan, maybe you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, we have, and I think it's possible that that is the outcome with Canada and Mexico, but the timing is unclear. They had originally there was a lot of expectation that there would be a deal to remove the steel and aluminum tariffs. By the time the negotiations were finished, when that didn't happen, the expectation shifted that it would be by the time they sign it, but now we're 3 days from that, and it's not clear if that will happen or what the next, I guess, goalpost will be.
Well, 3 days can be a long time. We just 3 days before the agreement was concluded on September 30th, there wasn't resounding optimism that we would actually come to a deal with Canada, and it happened just in a matter of days.
Yeah, absolutely. Could happen.
It could happen.
We hope so.
Yes, front row here. Wait, the microphone's coming over to you.
Thank you. I have a question for the panelists.
I'm from name and affiliation.
Yeah, I'm from Xinhua News Agency of China, and there's a provision in the USMCA that if either party wants to negotiate a free trade agreement with a non-market economy, it has to report to the other two parties. So, do you think this is a kind of a restriction for the three parties, and to what degree will this hamper ongoing negotiations between, I think, Canada and China for a bilateral trade agreement? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Chapter 32, which was that was going to be one of my questions. So thank you for asking it. Megan, I'll turn that one to you.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a new provision that was buried in the agreement, and it bars any country, or it mandates that any country that enters into trade negotiations with a non-market economy, which the U.S. administration views China to be, they first must notify the other partners, and then after a certain amount of time, the other partners can essentially kick them out of the agreement if they do pursue those trade talks. And so that was widely interpreted as being a way of pressuring Canada not to enter into trade talks with China. Justin Trudeau flew to Beijing in the middle of NAFTA negotiations to try to move those talks forward and launch formal free trade talks between Canada and China. Those haven't taken off, but then the understanding is that the Trump administration implemented this provision as a way of stopping that. So it is a restriction in a way, and it's also a way of sort of in the same vein that the TPP was considered a way of uniting several countries in bound to common rules against China. This is a way for the Trump administration to sort of cement Canada and Mexico on its side as best as it can, with common trade standards, and prevent them from negotiating with Beijing in a way that the administration doesn't like. And so the expectation is that this will likely be something the administration then pushes in future trade talks with Japan, with Europe, with the UK. The question is whether those countries would agree to it, but it is a restriction of sorts.
On that note, I like to always make sure that we end on time, and I want to first off thank my colleagues Patricia Thomas, Maria Fernanda Perez for putting this fantastic event together, as well as the rest of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center team and the Global Business and Economics program. We here at the Atlantic Council have been closely not only following but providing analysis and insight as part of the NAFTA renegotiation process, and now with USMCA. So please stay tuned for further events and publications. And I want to thank our fantastic panel, Undersecretary McKinney, Maria, Stephanie, and Megan. Fantastic to be partnering with Politico on this discussion. Look forward to doing more of the same. Thank you all for joining us. For those on webcast, I'm sorry we didn't provide lunch for you, but for everybody else in the room, great to have you with us today.